The Valorian conclave had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and in all that time, they had never known true fear until the day the Kreth came. Their civilization stretched across 7 beautiful worlds, each one a masterpiece of crystal towers and floating gardens that touched the clouds. And their ships moved between the stars like graceful dancers in an endless ballet of peace and discovery. And their libraries held the knowledge of 100 different species, who had come to them seeking wisdom and understanding. Counselor Aerith then stood at the great window of the Chamber of Light, watching the sky above her homeworld turn red with the fires of distant battle. And her 4 luminescent eyes reflected the destruction that was slowly consuming everything her people had built across millennia of careful progress. She was old by Valorian standards, having lived for nearly 800 years, and she had seen many things in her long life. But nothing had prepared her for this moment of absolute helplessness. The costlessness. Doors behind her slid open, and Commander Gavin Tall entered, his silver uniform torn and stained with the blood of colleagues who had died trying to defend their orbital stations. And his face carried the weight of news that no leader ever wanted to hear. "High Counselor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "Lesser Prime has fallen." And the defense grid held for only 6 hours before they overwhelmed it completely. Aerith did not turn from the window because she could not bear to see the despair in his eyes that would mirror her own feelings of utter failure. How many escaped? She asked. "Perhaps 10,000 out of 3 billion, Gavin replied. And the number hung in the air like a death sentence for everything they had believed about the universe. And their place in it, the Valorians were scholars, and artists and diplomats who had spent their entire existence believing that all conflicts could be resolved through understanding and communication and the sharing of knowledge. And they had never developed weapons because they had never imagined they would need them. When the first Kreth ships appeared at the edge of their territory 6 months ago, the Valorians had done what they always did when meeting a new species, and they sent their finest ambassadors with gifts of art and offers of friendship and trade. The Kreth had eaten the ambassadors while broadcasting the images across every communication channel, and the screams of dying diplomats had been the first indication that the universe was not the peaceful place the Valorians had always believed it to be. Elder Mira-san entered the chamber next, her ancient body supported by a floating chair that hummed softly as it carried her forward. And she had served on the council for 500 years and had never looked as defeated as she did in this moment. "The other species have refused our calls for help," she announced, her voice cracking with exhaustion and grief. "The Valorni have gone silent and we believe they are already dead. And the Thesans are scattered across the void with no fleet remaining to fight. And the Kandari have sealed their borders and will not respond to any transmission." Aerith finally turned from the window and faced what remained of her council. Barely 24 members, where once there had been 300 of the wisest beings in the galaxy. "So we are alone," she said. And it was not a question, but a statement of the terrible truth they all had to accept. A young aide named Daravel stepped forward from the shadows, where she had been listening, and she held a datapad in her trembling hands as she approached the council table with obvious nervousness. "High Counselor, there is one species we have not contacted," Dara said, and her voice was barely audible over the distant rumble of explosions that shook the building. "Who remains that could possibly help us?" Gavin asked with bitter resignation in his tone. "The humans," Dara replied. Silence fell over the chamber like a blanket of snow. And for a long moment, nobody spoke because the suggestion seemed so absurd that it hardly warranted a response. Elder San made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had contained any humor at all. "The humans," she repeated. "The species that has been traveling between stars for barely 300 of their short years, and who still fight among themselves over territory and resources like children arguing over toys. and whose ships are held together by primitive engineering that our students would be embarrassed to produce. They are persistent, Dara said, standing her ground despite the dismissive reaction of the council. I have studied their history extensively because I found them fascinating. And they come from a world that actively tries to kill them with earthquakes and floods and diseases and predators. Yet they not only survived, but thrived. Gavin shook his head slowly. They are primitives with loud weapons and no understanding of galactic politics. And they could not possibly stand against the Krath. They went to their moon not because it was easy, but because it was hard. Dara continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. And when they reached the stars, they did not stop to rest or celebrate. They just kept pushing forward into the unknown. And when the Shen raiders attacked their colony on Kepler 442b, the humans fought back with mining equipment and improvised explosives. And they won. Aerith studied the young aide with new interest, seeing the fire of conviction in her eyes that had long since faded from the older council members. Their weapons are crude, Gavin insisted, though his voice held less certainty than before. Their weapons work, Dara replied. And more importantly, they have something we do not have, something we have never had, and that is the willingness to fight even when the odds are impossible, to sacrifice themselves for others, to refuse to accept defeat even when defeat is certain. High Counselor Aerith Ven looked around the chamber at the faces of her people, and she saw fear and exhaustion and the desperate hope of those who have nothing left to lose. We have asked everyone else, she said quietly, and everyone else has refused or died or hidden. And the Krath will reach our homeworld in 3 cycles, and when they arrive, they will consume everything we are and everything we have ever been. She turned to Dara and placed a gentle hand on the young aide's shoulder. Send the message, Aerith commanded. Broad spectrum on every frequency, boosted by every relay station still functioning in our space. And let the humans know that we are dying, and we are asking for their help. The message went out across the void, traveling at the speed of light through the darkness between stars. And it carried the desperate hope of a civilization facing extinction. It's simply, we are the Valorian Conclave, and we are under attack by an enemy we cannot fight. And we cannot defend ourselves, and if anyone can hear this, please. We need help, and somewhere far away, in a cramped monitoring station on the edge of human space. A young ensign named Katie Brooks was just starting her boring night shift when her console suddenly lit up with an alien distress signal that would change the fate of the entire galaxy. Katie Brooks had joined the United Earth Navy because she wanted adventure and excitement and the chance to explore the unknown reaches of space. And at 23 years old, she had imagined herself discovering new worlds and making first contact with alien species and maybe finding something wonderful that would change humanity forever. Instead, she had spent the last 8 months at Relay Station Omega 7, which was a tiny metal box floating in the darkness at the very edge of human territory. And her job consisted mostly of listening to cosmic background radiation and cataloging asteroid trajectories and trying not to die of boredom. She was just reaching for her 3rd cup of coffee of the night when her console made a sound she had never heard before. A sharp, urgent beeping that cut through the quiet hum of the station. Like a knife through butter, Katie almost spilled her coffee all over her keyboard as she scrambled to check the readings. And what she saw made her heart stop beating for just a moment. It was an alien signal. And not just random noise from some distant pulsar, but an actual structured transmission with patterns that could only come from intelligent beings trying to communicate her. Hands were shaking as she ran the signal through the translation software. And when the words appeared on her screen, she read them 3 times because she could not believe what they said. Lieutenant Simmons, she called out, her voice cracking with excitement and fear. You need to see this right now. Sir, Lieutenant Danny Simmons was a career officer in his 50s who had seen enough strange things in his years of service to be cynical about almost everything. And he walked over to Katie's station with the casual pace of someone expecting another false alarm or equipment malfunction. Then he saw the translation on her screen, and his face went pale. "Get me a direct line to Admiral Vasquez at Central Command," he said, his voice suddenly sharp and urgent. "And wake up everyone else on this station, because nobody is sleeping tonight." Within 6 hours, the message had reached Earth. And within 12 hours, it had triggered the largest emergency session of the United Nations in human history. And within 24 hours, Admiral Lisa Vasquez was standing before a room full of politicians and military leaders and scientists explaining that an alien civilization was about to be completely destroyed. Admiral Vasquez was a tall woman in her 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes that had seen too many battles. And she had earned her position through decades of service and sacrifice. And now she faced the most difficult briefing of her entire career. The Valorians are a peaceful species that has existed for 12,000 years, she explained, pulling up star charts on the main display screen. They have never developed weapons because they never believed they would need them. And now they are facing extinction at the hands of something called the Kreth. Senator Greg Patterson, a heavyset man known for his belief that humanity should stay out of galactic affairs, leaned forward in his chair with a skeptical expression. "And why exactly is this our problem?" he asked. "We have enough troubles here on Earth without going halfway across the galaxy to fight someone else's war." Admiral Vasquez fixed him with a cold stare that had made seasoned officers tremble. "Because someday, Senator, we might be the ones sending that message into the void and praying that someone answers. And I would hope that when that day comes, there is still someone left in this galaxy willing to help." The debate raged for hours as politicians argued and generals calculated and scientists offered technical assessments. And some said humanity lacked the resources, while others worried it might be a trap. And a few suggested that they should just let the galaxy sort out its own problems. Captain Samuel Hayes had been listening quietly from the back of the room for most of the debate. And he was not a politician or a high-ranking admiral, just the commanding officer of the 7th Expeditionary Fleet, a collection of ships that had been patrolling the outer territories for the past 3 years. He was a man in his 40s, with tired eyes and calloused hands, and the kind of quiet authority that came not from rank but from the respect of those who served under him. When he finally stepped forward to speak, the room fell silent because everyone knew his reputation as a man who did not waste words. "I have 12 ships under my command," he said, his voice calm and steady. "They are not the newest or the most advanced vessels in our fleet. And my crews are tired because we have been on patrol for a long time and we were supposed to be heading home for shore leave." He paused and looked around the room at the assembled leaders of humanity. "But every single person serving under me signed up to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And that is what we do. That is who we are. That is the whole point of having a navy in the first place." Senator Patterson started to object, but Hayes continued speaking. "I'm going to help these people," he said simply. "Anyone who wants to join me is welcome. And anyone who does not can stay here and explain to their grandchildren why they chose to let an entire civilization die when they had the power to do something about it." The vote that followed was not unanimous, but it was enough to authorize the mission. Within 72 hours, a fleet of 47 ships had assembled at the edge of known space. And they were a mismatched collection of military vessels and converted freighters, and even a few private ships whose owners had volunteered for what everyone privately acknowledged might be a one-way trip from which none of them would return. Captain Hayes stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Constellation, Watching the fleet form up around him through the main view screen, his executive officer, Commander Ally Price, stood beside him with a datapad showing the status of every vessel in the formation. All ships report ready for departure. "Captain," she said. Hayes nodded and pressed the button that would broadcast his voice to every ship in the fleet. "All hands." "This is Captain Hayes," he said. "In a few minutes we are going to enter slipspace and travel farther than any human fleet has ever gone before. And we are going to fight an enemy we have never seen to save a people we barely know in a war we did not start." He paused and looked down at the stars that were about to stretch into lines as they jumped to faster than light travel. "Some of us will not come back from this mission. And I will not lie to you about that, but that is what makes us who we are. Because humanity does not turn away from those in need. We never have, and we never will. All ships, engage slipspace drives on my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark." The stars stretched into brilliant lines of light, and 47 human ships vanished into the void, carrying with them the desperate hope that they would arrive in time to make a difference. The journey through slipspace took 16 days, and during that time the crews of the human fleet prepared themselves for a battle. Unlike anything they had ever faced before, Commander Ben Cooper was in charge of reconnaissance, and he commanded the frigate Sparrow, a small fast ship designed for scouting and intelligence gathering rather than direct combat. He was a quiet man in his 30s with steady hands and sharp eyes, and he had volunteered for the dangerous job of being the first to see what they were up against when the fleet dropped out of slipspace at the edge of Valorian territory. Captain Hayes immediately ordered the Sparrow to move ahead and gather information about the enemy. What Ben Cooper saw when he approached the Creth formation made his blood run cold. "Captain Hayes," he reported through the encrypted communication channel, his voice carefully controlled despite the fear twisting in his gut. "I am transmitting visual data now, and sir, you need to see this for yourself." The images that appeared on the constellation's main screen showed something that looked like a nightmare made real. The Creth were not a species in any sense that humans understood, and their ships were not built from metal or composite materials like normal vessels, but were instead grown from organic matter that pulsed and writhed with horrible life. Each bioship looked like a tumor floating in space, covered with tendrils and feeding tubes and openings that served purposes no human could identify. And they ranged in size from small fighters to massive capital ships that dwarfed anything in the human fleet. I count at least 200 capital-class bioships in the main formation, Ben continued, with thousands of smaller craft surrounding them like a swarm of insects around a hive. And they are all moving toward the Valorian homeworld at constant velocity. Captain Hayes studied the images with a grim expression, and beside him, Commander Ally Price was already calculating the odds in her head. "They outnumber us at least 10 to 1, she said quietly. "Probably more like 20 to 1 when you count the smaller craft. Any sign they have detected us?" Hayes asked. "Negative, sir," Ben replied. "I am maintaining minimal emissions at the edge of their sensor range, and they do not seem to be looking for threats because I do not think they have ever encountered anything that could threaten them." Hayes nodded slowly, his mind already working on the problem before him. "Pull back and rejoin the fleet, Commander. We need to make a plan." The planning session that followed took place in the main conference room of the constellation, with the senior officers of the fleet gathered around a holographic display showing the Creth formation. Lieutenant Kevin Ross was a young engineer from the technical division who had been studying everything humanity knew about the Creth since they left Earth, and he had some ideas that were either brilliant or completely insane. "The Creth are not really a military force in the way we understand it," he explained, highlighting different parts of the swarm on the display. They are more like a feeding organism, a collective entity that moves toward resources and consumes them and then moves on to find more resources. Commander Price frowned at the young officer. That does not sound encouraging. Actually, it might be exactly what we need, Kevin replied. Because the Kreth have never needed tactics or strategy. They just overwhelm everything with sheer numbers and then eat whatever is left. And that means they have no experience fighting something that actually fights back. Captain Hayes leaned forward with interest. Go on. If we can hurt them, really hurt them in a way they have never been hurt before, they might not know how to respond, and their entire swarm could fall into confusion because they have never had to deal with prey that bites back. Ben Cooper had returned from his scouting mission and was studying the holographic display with careful attention. Where do we hit them? He asked. Kevin highlighted a pulsing mass at the center of the formation that was larger than all the other bioships combined. That is the central organism, he said. It is not really a ship. It is more like the brain of the entire swarm. And every Kreth unit is connected to it through some kind of psychic or biological link that we do not fully understand. So, if we destroy that thing, the whole swarm dies. Commander Price asked with obvious skepticism. Maybe. Or maybe they just become confused and disorganized. But either way, it gives the Valorians a chance to evacuate their remaining population and gives us a chance to actually win this fight. Captain Hayes stood up and walked to the display, studying this central organism with the calculating gaze of a man planning a very dangerous mission. Getting to that thing will not be easy, he said. We would have to fight through hundreds of enemy ships just to get close enough to fire on it, which is why we need a distraction, Kevin replied. We split the fleet into multiple strike groups, each one hitting a different target. And while the Kreth are dealing with attacks from multiple directions, the main battle group punches through to the central organism. Lieutenant Amanda Cole, who commanded the destroyer Defiant, spoke up from her seat at the table. What kind of targets would draw their attention away from their brain? Kevin highlighted several points on the display. The supply tendrils that feed biomass to the main swarm. The nursery ships where new Kreth are spawned. The sensory clusters that they use to detect prey. If we hit all of these at once, we can create enough chaos to open a path. Captain Hayes was quiet for a long moment, and everyone in the room knew that he was weighing the lives of his crews against the lives of billions of Valorians. It is a good plan, he finally said. It is also incredibly dangerous and will probably get a lot of people killed. He looked around the room at the faces of his officers, seeing determination and fear and the quiet acceptance of people who had already made their peace with what was coming. But it is the only plan we have, and those people out there are counting on us. So we are going to make it work. He turned back to the display and began assigning ships to their strike groups. All ships will move into position within the next 6 hours, and we attack at dawn. Valorian time. Commander Price raised an eyebrow. Dawn, sir? Hayes allowed himself a small smile that held no humor. It seems appropriate. We are either bringing a new day for these people, or we are dying with the sunrise. Either way, I want them to remember when humanity arrived to answer their call. 1 year after the battle, a memorial was unveiled on Valoria Primate, stood in the center of the capital city. A towering structure of crystal and steel that combined the aesthetic traditions of both species, and it bore the names of every human who had died fighting to save a people they had never met. High Counselor Aerith Venn spoke at the dedication ceremony, a voice carrying across the vast plaza where millions of Valorians had gathered to pay their respects. 1 year ago, we faced extinction, she said. Our cities were burning, our people were dying, and we had nowhere left to turn, so we sent a message into the darkness. A plea for help that we did not really believe anyone would answer. She paused and looked at the human delegation standing in the front row, including Admiral Hayes and the surviving crew members of the original fleet. But humanity answered. They came across the void in ships held together by determination and hope. They faced an enemy that had destroyed civilizations far older and more powerful than their own. And they won. The crowd was silent, listening with the intensity of people who had lived through a nightmare and were still learning how to believe that it was over. The names on this memorial belonged to men and women who gave their lives for strangers, people they had never met and would never know. And we must never forget what that sacrifice means. Aerith's voice grew stronger as she continued. It means that we are not alone in this universe. It means that there are beings who will stand with us in our darkest hour. It means that compassion and courage can triumph over hatred and destruction. She turned to face the memorial, her 4 eyes reflecting the light of the setting sun. To the fallen heroes of humanity, we say thank you. We say that your sacrifice was not in vain. We say that we will honor your memory by building a galaxy worthy of your courage. Commander Ben Cooper watched the ceremony from his position among the human delegation, and he thought about all the people who should have been standing beside him. He thought about Lieutenant Commander Rachel Stone, who had died leading the attack on the nursery ships, and about all the crew members of the Morning Star who had followed her into oblivion. He thought about the volunteers from the Spirit of Earth, civilians who had never worn a uniform but who had given their lives to protect the medical ship behind them. He thought about his own close calls, the moments when a slightly different trajectory or a marginally less accurate shot would have meant his death instead of his survival. After the ceremony, he walked to the memorial alone and found the section dedicated to the crew of the Sparrow. There were names he recognized, people he had served with for years, and seeing them carved into the crystal made the loss feel real in a way that it had not before. They were good people, said a voice behind him, and he turned to find Dara Vel standing there, the young aide, who had first suggested contacting humanity. They were the best. Ben agreed. Dara stood beside him and looked up at the names, a luminescent skin glowing softly in the fading light. I have been reading about human history, she said. You have a long tradition of memorials like this, places where you honor those who died in service to others. We believe in remembering, Ben said, because if we forget, then their deaths become meaningless. But if we remember, then they live on in everything we do. That is beautiful, Dara said quietly, and it explains a lot about your species. They stood together in silence for a long while, watching as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Eventually, Ben spoke again. What happens now, do you think? Dara considered the question carefully before answering. Now we build something new, she said, something that has never existed before. A community of species bound together not by fear or conquest, but by shared values and mutual respect. She looked at him with eyes that held both hope and determination. And we make sure that what happened to us never happens to anyone else, so that no species ever has to send a desperate message into the void and wonder if anyone will answer. Ben nodded slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. That sounds like a lot of work. It will be, Dara agreed. But after what humanity did for us, we know that hard work and sacrifice can accomplish the impossible. She smiled, and Ben realized that it was the first time he had ever seen a Valorian smile. Besides, she added, we have good teachers now. Admiral Hayes found Ben at the memorial an hour later, still standing there with Dara as the stars wheeled overhead. There you are, Hayes said. I've been looking for you. Ben straightened and saluted. Sorry, sir. I was just paying my respects. Hayes waved off the apology and stood beside them, looking up at the memorial. I come here every time I visit Valoria, he admitted. It helps me remember why we do what we do. The council has made a decision, Dara said. They want to establish a permanent human presence on our world, an embassy and a training facility and a research center, all combined into one complex. She looked at Ben with an expression that suggested this information was particularly relevant to him. and they have specifically requested that Commander Cooper be assigned to lead the human delegation. Ben stared at her in surprise. "May? Why me?" "Because you have shown yourself to be brave and compassionate and wise," Dara replied. "And because you treat our people with respect instead of condescension. And because we believe you can help us become the species we need to be." Hayes nodded in confirmation. "The assignment is yours if you want it, Ben, but I will not order you to take it. This has to be your choice." Ben looked around at the memorial, at the names of his fallen comrades, at the stars that have been his home for so many years, and then he looked at Dara, at the hope in her eyes and the future she represented. "I will do it," he said. "Someone needs to make sure this alliance works, and I cannot think of anything more important than that." Hayes smiled and clapped him on the shoulder. "I was hoping you would say that." The attack began exactly at dawn on Valoria Prime, just as Captain Hayes had promised. And for the first time in their long existence, the Kreth experienced something they had never known before. They experienced Resistance Strike Group. Alpha hit the nursery ships on the eastern flank of the swarm, and the destroyers Morning Star and Valiant led the charge with their main guns blazing, tearing into the soft organic hulls of vessels that had never been designed to withstand actual weapons. Fire Lieutenant Commander Rachel Stone commanded the Morning Star, and she was a woman in her 40s who had spent her entire career waiting for a fight that actually mattered. "All batteries fire at will," she ordered as her ship dove into the heart of the nursery cluster. "Target the spawning chambers and do not stop shooting until these things are dead." The Kreth nursery ships were massive organic structures that produced thousands of new swarm units every day. And they had no weapons because they had never needed them. And when the human missiles began tearing them apart, they could do nothing but writhe in confused. Agony Strike Group Beta attacked from the opposite direction, targeting the sensory clusters that the Kreth used to detect and track their prey. Commander Ben Cooper led this assault from the bridge of the Sparrow, coordinating a dozen smaller ships in a precision attack that blinded the swarm one cluster at a time. "Concentrate fire on the central optic mass," he ordered, watching as the organic sensors exploded under the combined firepower of his ships. "They cannot hunt what they cannot see." Strike Group Gamma went after the feeding tendrils, the long organic tubes that connected the scattered bioships to the central organism and carried nutrients throughout the swarm. These tendrils were tough and regenerated quickly, but the human ships were relentless, cutting and burning and bombing until the flow of biomass was reduced to a trickle. And while all of this was happening, Captain Hayes led the main battle group directly toward the heart of the swarm. The Constellation was surrounded by the remaining heavy ships of the fleet, a wedge of steel and fury pushing through the chaos toward the central organism that pulsed at the center of everything. Enemy contacts on all sides. Commander Price reported from her station, her voice calm despite the explosions that shook the ship. "They are converging on our position. Let them come," Hayes replied. "All weapons free. Target anything that gets close enough to threaten our advance." The Kreth had never encountered anything like this before. For thousands of years, they had swept across the galaxy, consuming everything in their path. And species had run from them or hidden from them or died, begging for mercy that never came. No one had ever stood there, ground and fought back with such savage determination. The human ships were smaller and weaker and vastly outnumbered, but they were also fast and unpredictable and crewed by beings who absolutely refused to accept that they were supposed to lose. Lieutenant Amanda Cole commanded the destroyer Defiant from the heart of the battle, and her ship had been scheduled for decommissioning before this mission. An old vessel that should have been retired years ago now. It was dancing through the swarm like a warrior in the prime of life. "Port shields are failing," her tactical officer shouted over the chaos of alarms and explosions. "We have multiple hull breaches on decks 3 through 7. Redirect power from life support in the damaged sections," Amanda ordered, her hands flying across her console as she personally targeted a Kreth cruiser that was moving to attack the constellation. Anyone in those areas should already be in emergency suits. The Defiance guns fired and the Kreth cruiser shuddered and began to break apart, its organic hull splitting open to spill its contents into the vacuum of space. All across the battlefield, similar scenes were playing out. The frigate Valor held position over a damaged transport, refusing to retreat, even as Kreth boarding tendrils attached to its hull and tried to burrow through the armor. The cruiser Northern Light executed a devastating attack run on a Kreth capital ship, crippling its propulsion and leaving it spinning helplessly in the void. The cargo vessel Spirit of Earth, crewed entirely by civilian volunteers who had never fired a weapon in anger before this day, flew directly into the path of a Kreth energy attack that had been aimed at a medical ship filled with wounded sailors. Strike Group Alpha reports 60% casualties, Commander Price announced, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Strike Group Beta has lost 4 ships but completed their objective. What about Gamma? Hayes asked. Still fighting. Commander Stone reports that the feeding tendrils have been severed, but they are taking heavy fire. Hayes studied the tactical display, watching the icons that represented his ships flickering and sometimes disappearing entirely as the battle raged around them. The path to the central organism was finally clear, blasted open by the sacrifice of brave men and women who had given everything to create this opportunity. Signal all ships in the main group, he ordered. We are making our run. Maximum speed. All weapons ready. The central organism loomed before them on the view screen, a pulsing nightmare of tissue and tentacles and malevolent intelligence that stretched for kilometers in every direction. It was the brain of the swarm, the thing that gave purpose and direction to millions of Kreth units, and had never been threatened in all the millennia of its existence until now. All ships, target the Cortex region, Hayes commanded. Fire everything we have. Missiles streaked through space, followed by energy beams and kinetic rounds and everything else the human fleet could throw at the massive organisms, and impacts tore into its flesh, burning and blasting and destroying. And the creature screamed. It was not a sound that traveled through the vacuum of space, but rather something that every being in the fleet felt in their minds. A psychic shriek of pain and rage from something that had never known either emotion before. It is working, Kevin Ross reported from his station, his voice shaking with exhaustion and desperate hope. The swarm is losing coordination. Ships are breaking off their attacks and moving randomly. Keep firing, Hayes ordered. Do not stop until that thing is dead. The constellation took a direct hit that ripped through its engineering section, and alarms screamed throughout the ship as damage reports flooded the bridge. But Hayes kept his ship on course, kept his weapons firing, kept fighting even as everything around him burned, because that was what humans did. They fought until there was nothing left to fight with. And then they found something else to throw at their enemies when the central organism finally collapsed, imploding in on itself like a dying star. The effect on the swarm was immediate and total. Millions of Kreth units suddenly found themselves cut off from the guiding intelligence that had controlled their every action. And they did not know what to do. Some simply stopped moving and drifted helplessly in space. Others turned on each other in confusion, unable to distinguish friend from enemy without the central mind to tell them the difference, and the rest fled, scattering in every direction like cockroaches when the lights come on. Captain Hayes slumped in his command chair, blood running from a cut on his forehead where he had been thrown against a console during one of the many impacts. Status report, he managed to say, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. The numbers that came back were devastating. 23 ships destroyed out of the original. 47,000 of crew members dead or missing in action. Nearly every surviving vessel was damaged. some so badly they could barely maintain life support, but the craft were broken, and somewhere below them, billions of Valorians were looking up at the sky and realizing that they were going to live. 10 years had passed since the Battle of Valoria, and the galaxy had been transformed beyond recognition. Galactic Defense Coalition had grown to include 47 member species, each one contributing what they could to the shared mission of protecting the innocent and responding to those in need. Admiral Samuel Hayes had retired from active duty 3 years earlier, his body finally worn out by decades of service. But his legacy lived on in the ships that patrolled the space lanes and the alliances that held the galaxy together. He spent his retirement on a small farm in Nebraska, tending crops and watching the stars at night, and occasionally receiving visits from old friends who wanted to share memories of the adventures they had survived together. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, a transport landed in his field, and a tall figure emerged that he had not seen in person for many years. "Hi." Counselor Aerith Venn walked toward him with the slow grace of someone who had lived for nearly 1,000 years, her luminescent skin glowing softly in the fading light. "Hi, Counselor," Hayes said, rising from his chair with some difficulty. "This is an unexpected honor." "I wanted to thank you in person," Aerith replied, "because there is something I never told you. Something that has weighed on me for all these years." She sat beside him on the porch, looking out at the fields of corn that stretched toward the horizon. "When we sent that message into the void, I did not believe anyone would answer," she admitted. "I thought we were simply going through the motions of hope while waiting for the inevitable end." Hayes nodded slowly. "I figured as much. But you came anyway," Aerith continued. "You and your fleet of battered ships and exhausted crews. You came because you could not bear to let us die alone." She turned to look at him with eyes that held the wisdom of centuries. That single act of compassion has echoed through the galaxy in ways that neither of us could have imagined. Because now every species knows that there is someone who will answer when they call. We just did what we had to do," Hayes said. The same simple answer he had given 100 times before. "No," Aerith replied firmly. "You did what no one else would do. And that is a very different thing." She reached into her robes and produced a small crystal, the same type that held the Valorian archives. "This contains the complete history of the Valorian Conclave," she said. "Every discovery, every work of art, every philosophical debate, everything we have learned in 12,000 years of existence." She placed the crystal in his hands. "We've already shared much of this with humanity through official channels. But this particular archive contains something more personal, the stories and memories of our people, the things that make us who we are." Hayes looked at the crystal with confusion. "Why give this to me?" "Because you more than anyone deserve to understand what you saved," Aerith said. "And because I wanted you to know that your name will be remembered in our histories for as long as the Valorian people exist." They sat together in silence as darkness fell and the stars emerged. The same stars that Hayes had traveled through so many times in his long career. "Do you have any regrets?" Aerith asked eventually. Hayes thought about the question for a long while before answering. "I wish we could have saved more," he said. "I wish we had arrived sooner. I wish I had been smarter or faster or better in some way that would have meant fewer deaths." He paused and looked at the stars. "But I do not regret going. I do not regret answering the call, because that is the one thing I know for certain that I got right." Aerith nodded in understanding. "That is exactly what I expected you to say. And that is exactly why your species has become the heart of everything we are building together." She rose to leave, but paused before returning to her transport. "One more thing. Admiral Hayes, the Coalition has decided to name our flagship after you. The Samuel Hayes will be the most advanced vessel ever built by any member species, and it will carry the mission of answering distress calls wherever they come from." Hayes felt tears forming in his eyes. something that had not happened in many years. "I do not know what to say." Aerith smiled. The same expression that Dara had shown Ben all those years ago at the memorial. "You do not have to say anything. You have already said everything that matters through your actions." She walked back to her transport and was gone, leaving Hayes alone with the stars and the memories of a life well spent. He sat on his porch for hours that night, thinking about the young captain he had been when he first answered the Valorian call, and about all the things that had happened since the galaxy was safer now than it had ever been. Not because of weapons or fortifications, but because species had learned to trust each other and work together, and it all started because humanity had made a simple choice. A choice that any child could understand, but that somehow no other species had been able to make. They had chosen to help when help was needed. Years later, when Admiral Samuel Hayes passed away in his sleep at the age of 93, the entire galaxy mourned his funeral, was attended by representatives of every species in the coalition. And the ceremony was broadcast across 1,000,000 worlds at the base of his memorial. Beside the simple headstone that marked where his body lay were the words that he had spoken to his fleet before the Battle of Valoria. "We are humanity. We do not leave our friends behind. We do not ignore those in need. We fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. This is who we are." And across the galaxy, whenever someone heard those words, they remembered the moment when everything changed. The moment when a desperate species called out into the void, expecting nothing but silence, and humanity answered. 6 months after the Battle of Valoria, the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Kreth swarm had not been completely destroyed, and scattered remnants still drifted through the outer reaches of known space. But without their central organism, they were like a body without a brain. Dangerous only to those unlucky enough to stumble into their path. More importantly, the fear that had paralyzed the galaxy for so long was finally beginning to fade. Lieutenant Kevin Ross stood in a laboratory on Valoria Prime, surrounded by equipment that combined human engineering with 12,000 years of Valorian science. And he was working on something that would change space travel forever. "The Valorian slip drive technology is more efficient than ours by a factor of 10, he explained to Admiral Vasquez, who had traveled all the way from Earth to see the progress being made. "But our propulsion systems are more robust and can operate in conditions that would shut down Valorian engines completely." The Admiral studied the schematics with the eye of someone who had commanded warships for decades. "So you are combining the best of both designs?" "Exactly," Kevin said with obvious excitement. "The new hybrid drive will be faster and more reliable than anything either of our species could have built alone. And we expect to have the first prototype ready for testing within 3 months. This was happening everywhere, not just in propulsion research, but in medicine and agriculture and computing and dozens of other fields, where human innovation was combining with Valorian wisdom to create something greater than either could achieve separately." Commander Ben Cooper had been assigned to lead the Joint Defense Initiative, and he found himself working with Valorian officers who had never held a weapon in their lives, but who were eager to learn how to protect their people. "The key is not just to fight," Ben explained during a training session. "The key is to know when to fight and when to find another way. Because we humans have made plenty of mistakes over the centuries by rushing into battles that could have been avoided." A young Valorian officer named Talon Vel, who was Dara's younger brother, raised his hand. "But how do you decide when fighting is necessary?" Ben considered the question carefully before answering. "You fight when innocent people are in danger, and there is no other way to protect them. You fight when running away would mean abandoning those who cannot defend themselves. You fight when the cost of not fighting is greater than the cost of war." He paused and looked around at the Valorian faces, watching him with intense concentration. "But you always remember that fighting is a last resort, not a first choice. Because once the shooting starts, people die. And you have to be willing to carry that weight for the rest of your life. The Valorians were learning fast. And within a few years, they would have a proper defense fleet of their own. Ships crewed by beings who had never imagined themselves as warriors, but who were determined to never again be helpless in the face of aggression. Meanwhile, Captain Hayes had been promoted to Rear Admiral and placed in command of the newly formed Galactic Defense Coalition, an alliance of 12 species that had agreed to mutual protection and cooperation. It was a position he had never wanted, and one he felt completely unqualified for. But the other species had insisted that a human lead the coalition, because they trusted humanity in a way they did not trust each other. You have no imperial ambitions, the Thesan representative had explained. During the founding conference, you did not come to our rescue expecting to rule us or exploit us. You came because it was the right thing to do. And that is the kind of leadership this galaxy needs. Hayes accepted the position with the same sense of duty that had driven him to answer the Valorian distress call in the first place. His first priority was establishing a network of early warning stations throughout the galaxy, so that no species would ever again be caught off guard by a threat like the Krethis. Second priority was creating a rapid response force that could reach any allied world within days. Bringing help to those who needed it before it was too late. Commander Price served as his chief of staff, and together they worked to build something that had never existed before. A galactic community based not on fear or domination, but on mutual respect and shared commitment to protecting the innocent Katie Brooks, the young ensign who had first received the Valorian distress signal, had been promoted twice and was now in charge of the communication network that linked all the allied worlds together. She remembered those boring months at Relay Station Omega-7, listening to cosmic background radiation and dreaming of adventure. And she smiled at how dramatically her life had changed. Incoming message from the Kandari homeworld. One of her technicians reported, "They are requesting to join the coalition." The Kandari had been one of the species that had refused to help the Valorians when the Kreth attacked, sealing their borders and hoping that if they ignored the problem, it would go away. Now they were asking to join the alliance that humanity had built. Katie forwarded the message to Admiral Hayes with a personal note attached. "The galaxy is changing faster than anyone expected," she wrote. "And it is changing because of what we did, because we answered when no one else would." Hayes read her message and allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The sacrifices made at Valoria had not been in vain, and the alliance they were building would ensure that such sacrifices would never be necessary again. But he also knew that the work was far from finished. Somewhere out there, beyond the edges of known space, other threats might be waiting, and the galaxy would need to be ready when they arrived. That was why he worked so hard, why he slept so little, why he spent every waking moment trying to prepare for dangers that had not yet appeared, because the next time someone called for help, he wanted humanity to be even more ready to answer. The aftermath of the battle was both a celebration and a funeral. High Counselor Arith Ven had watched the entire fight from the observation deck of the last Valorian orbital station, and she had seen ships smaller than her personal transport throw themselves against enemies that should have been impossible to defeat. She had watched beings she had once dismissed as primitive savages fight with a courage and determination that her own people had never possessed. And she had wept when she saw them dying to protect strangers they had never met. Now, as the surviving human fleet limped toward Valorian space, she prepared to meet the people who had saved her entire civilization from extinction. The constellation was barely holding together when it entered orbit around Valoria Prime, And Captain Hayes looked like a man who had aged 20 years. In a single day his uniform was torn and stained with blood. Some of it his own and some belonging to crew members he had tried to save during the battle. And he walked with a limp from an injury he had refused to let the medics treat until everyone else had been cared for. But he stood straight when he faced the Valorian delegation, because he was still a captain in the United Earth Navy, and he would represent his species with dignity, no matter how exhausted he felt. "High Counselor," he said, offering a tired salute. "Captain Samuel Hayes, United Earth Navy. We came as fast as we could. Aerith did not know the proper human protocols for this situation, because her people had never needed to thank anyone for saving their lives before, so she did something that the Valorians had not done for centuries. Something that was reserved only for the most profound expressions of gratitude and respect. She bowed to him, deeply and completely, lowering her head until her forehead nearly touched the ground. "You came at all," she said, her voice thick with emotion that she did not try to hide. "We sent a message into the void, hoping that someone might hear, hoping that someone might care enough to answer. And you did, you who owed us nothing. You who had every reason to stay safe in your own territory." Hayes helped her rise. Uncomfortable with such an extreme display of gratitude, "We heard people calling for help," he said simply. "That was reason enough for us to come." In the days that followed, the Valorians opened their world to the surviving human crew's medical facilities that had been designed for Valorian physiology were hastily modified to treat human wounded. And Valorian engineers worked alongside their human counterparts to repair the damaged ships. The Valorian people lined the streets whenever human sailors walked through their cities, and they reached out to touch them as if they were holy figures from ancient legends. And children were lifted up so they could see the faces of the beings who had saved them from the monsters. Commander Ben Cooper found himself surrounded by a crowd of young Valorians who wanted to hear stories about the battle, and he told them about the bravery of the crews who had fought and died, about the ships that had sacrificed themselves so others could survive. "Why did you do it?" one of the children asked, and it was the same question that everyone on the planet seemed to be asking. "Why did you risk everything for people you had never met?" Ben thought about the question for a long moment, trying to find words that would translate across the gulf between species, because that is what humans do. He finally said, "We run toward the fire instead of away from it. We hear someone crying in the darkness, and we cannot make ourselves look the other way. It is not logical, and it is not strategic. It is just who we are." The child stared at him with wide eyes that held a new understanding of what the universe could be. "Can you teach us to be like that?" they asked. Ben smiled sadly, thinking of all the ships that would never fly again and all the friends who would never come home. "I hope so," he said. "I really hope so, High Counselor." Aerith met with Captain Hayes in her private chambers the night before the fleet was scheduled to depart for home, and she had spent hours preparing what she wanted to say. "We have decided to share everything with you," she told him. 12,000 years of scientific knowledge, technological advances that will take your species centuries forward in a single leap. All of it is yours." Hayes shook his head slowly. "We did not do this for payment, High Counselor." "I know," Aerith replied. "That is exactly why you deserve it. You helped us because it was right, not because you expected anything in return. And that is precisely the kind of species that should have access to our knowledge." She handed him a small crystal device that contained more information than all of Earth's libraries combined. "Consider it not a payment but a partnership," she said. "Because after today, our fates are bound together, and we want to face whatever comes next side by side with humanity." News of the battle spread across the galaxy faster than any ship could travel. Other species who had hidden from the Kreth began to emerge from their refuges, And they came to Valorian space not just seeking safety, but seeking humanity survivors. From the Thesan colonies arrived in battered ships, and the scattered remnants of a dozen other peoples who had fled the Kreth advance came with them. And all of them wanted to meet the strange young species that had done what no one else would. "You could have stayed home," a Thesan elder said to Commander Price at a diplomatic reception. "The Kreth had not targeted your worlds. You were safe. So why did you risk everything for strangers?" Price thought about all the reports she had read during the journey, all the desperate messages from species begging for help that had gone unanswered. "Because someone had to," she said. "And no one else was going to do it, so we did." The elder was quiet for a long moment, processing this answer that seemed both simple and profound. "Perhaps we have much to learn from your people," they finally said. Captain Hayes stood at the window of his temporary quarters on Valoria Prime, looking up at the stars that seemed to shine a little brighter now than they had before. His fleet had paid a terrible price for this victory, and he knew that families back on Earth were already receiving notifications that their loved ones would not be coming home. But when he thought about the billions of Valorians who would wake up tomorrow mourning because of what his people had done, when he thought about the hope that had been restored to a galaxy that had been drowning in despair, he knew that the price had been worth paying. Admiral Vasquez contacted him through a quantum communication link that somehow still worked despite all the damage the ship had taken. "You did good work out there, Captain," she said. "The whole planet is talking about what you accomplished." "We lost almost half the fleet," Hayes replied. "We lost thousands of good people." "I know," the Admiral said softly. "And we will honor every single one of them. But you also saved billions of lives, and you showed the entire galaxy what humanity stands for. And that matters too." Hayes nodded slowly, too tired to argue. "What happens now, Admiral?" "Now you come home," she said, "and then we figure out what kind of galaxy we want to build. Because I have a feeling that after today, everyone is going to be looking at us differently." She was right about that. In the weeks that followed, requests for alliance began pouring in from species that had never paid attention to humanity before, and trade offers and technology exchanges and proposals for cooperation came from every corner of the known galaxy, because now everyone knew that there was a species out there that would answer when no one else would. A species that would fight for strangers and die for people they had never met, and in a galaxy that had learned to be afraid. That knowledge was worth more than all the crystal towers on Valoria Prime.